Now, I'm back, folks. So, what effect has offshoring had on production and employment in developed and developing countries? Now, one thing that I should point out in regards to this literature, it does not differentiate between developed and developing countries, but it does differentiate economies in terms of their sizes. So the assumption to which I'll move henceforth is the assumption that the smaller economy is the developing economy and the developed economy is the large economy. But China, Brazil, and India notwithstanding, because they are developing economies, but in terms of their relative size, they can affect world prices, right? So if we then go on to the effect that offshoring of low-task skills has on the production and employment, then we look at this particular equation over here that is asserted by the mathematical model by Grossman and Rosie Hansenberg of 2006A, right? So this equation is decomposed into the productivity effect, relative supply effect, and the labor supply effect, right? So the first term in equation star represents the first term on the equation star on the right. This term over here represents the productivity effect, right? And this minus omega over here is greater than 0, right? So the productivity effect is when an increase in the technology of offshoring results in an increase in the production of the factor that is mostly used in the intermediate input or task, right? So that means that when we have a situation whereby offshoring of these of these tasks happens, then that increases the marginal productivity of the factors whereby the input is used most intensely. Now this has the ripple effect of increase in profitability of companies. This effect then has the effect again of the companies wanting a greater labor demand. So once they want a greater level of labor demand, this is actually all good for the economy, and to which most of the literature tends to reject or does not have it in what they assert in regards to the productivity effect. But Grossman and Rosie Hansenberg, this is what they were able to introduce novelly in their mathematical model, right? Now we have the second term, which is the relative price effect, right? If the commodity price increases, or with that being the home export relative to the prices of the input or import, then we will see the Stopler and Samuelson effect, right? So as we've seen from the Heckscher-Ohlin model, the Stopler and Samuelson effect implies that an increase in one of the commodity prices relative to the other will mean that the marginal returns of one of the factors will increase relative to or increase or decrease relative to the other, right? And that's the relative supply effect. Now the labor supply effect now is as the cost of offshoring of low-skilled labor decreases, this has the effect of increasing the labor supply, to which the jobs that will be lost, to which the lost will be a shredding of jobs in the home economy, as they have to be absorbed in other sectors of the economy to do other tasks, right? So now what therefore this then implies is that there is an effect on the labor supply, because once there is an increase in the labor supply as a consequence of offshoring, then that therefore then means that there will be a depression in wages because there's an increase in the labor supply, right? So if we then look at what the amalgamation of what this equation therefore asserts is one to which is a bit ambiguous in terms of what happens in results to offshoring, right? So in the case of the developing countries, because we assume they are smaller countries, what will therefore then tend to happen is that we will then focus on the productivity effect and the labor supply effect, not on the relative supply effect, because a small economy does not have an effect on world prices, right? So in regards to the developing countries, what is of import is a productivity effect, and if it's greater than the labor supply effect, then that means that we will then, as a consequence, have a greater wage increase of the task to which is being offshored. So the converse is also true if the labor supply effect is greater than the productivity effect in the developing countries. We therefore also then need to consider what happens in the developed countries. Now the relative price effect comes into play because the bigger economies have effect on world prices. Now what therefore this then means is that we need to therefore then see what would happen in relation to productivity effect, relative price effect, and the labor supply effect. And if the productivity effect is greater than both of them, then we have the situation whereby the wage increases, and we've seen that in the United States from 1997 to 2004 from the data that was compiled by these gentlemen over here. Or ladies, I don't know what their sex is necessarily. So now, in terms of then what happens to the skilled laborers or those that perform the skilled tasks, now this equation over here is what tells us what happens in that regard. So now we see therefore then that the relative price effect and the relative labor supply effect is a positive to this sector of the economy or to the laborers that perform these tasks. Right? We therefore then see that there is no productivity effect in this equation. What therefore this then implies is that once there's an increase in offshoring, what we will therefore then see is that because the price of the home export increases, this therefore implies that there is greater returns that goes to these laborers for as a consequence of the Stokely-Samuelson effect, right? And then the labor supply effect also benefits them positively. So that is that is the answer to the question: what does offshoring have in regards to the impact on wages and production in developed and developing countries? Thank you.